chain. The hospital doors locked behind her at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Grace Okafor walked out of the building where she had worked for 19 years in handcuffs. Two police cruisers sat in the parking lot with their lights turning slow circles against the brick walls of Cape Breton Regional Hospital. The officers hadn't needed to come with sirens. Grace wasn't running. She wasn't fighting. She stood perfectly still in the November cold while a young constable read out charges she didn't understand. Theft of controlled substances, trafficking in opioids, criminal negligence, and the words floated past her like snow because her mind was somewhere else entirely. It was on a pair of small red mittens she had knitted 20 years ago for a girl who didn't have any, and on the quiet, terrifying thought that maybe this was where all of it had always been heading. But before we get to those handcuffs, before the charges and the courtroom, and the truth that almost died in a filing cabinet on the 4th floor of a hospital in Nova Scotia, we need to go back. 20 years back, to a parking lot, a snowstorm, and a woman who should have kept driving. Grace Okafor was 34 the winter everything changed. She had come to Canada from Lagos at 22 with a nursing degree, $300, and the name of a cousin in Halifax who turned out to have moved to Calgary 6 months earlier. She figured it out anyway. She always figured it out. She worked nights at a long-term care home in Dartmouth while upgrading her credentials, passed the NCLEX on her first attempt, and took a posting at Cape Breton Regional because nobody else wanted it, and the signing bonus covered 3 months of rent. Sydney, Nova Scotia, was not a place that newcomers chose. It was a place that chose you by default, a small town on an island at the edge of the continent where the wind came off the Atlantic, like it had a personal grudge, and the winters lasted long enough to become a personality trait. Grace liked it. She liked the way the old miners at Tim Hortons called her dear, without it sounding like a lie. She liked the silence of the night shift, the rhythm of checking vitals and adjusting IV drips and sitting with patients who couldn't sleep because their pain was louder than the darkness. She had been married briefly to a man named Paul who sold insurance in Halifax and didn't understand why she wouldn't transfer to a city hospital. The marriage ended the way quiet things end, not with shouting, but with a slow leak of air until there was nothing left to breathe. After Paul, Grace stopped expecting company. She filled her house with books, and her evenings with long walks along the harbor, and her weekends with the gospel choir at Mount Olive Baptist Church. And if her life was small, it was hers, and that was enough. It was a Thursday evening in January of 2006 when Grace pulled into the Tim Hortons on George Street to pick up a large double-double before her overnight shift. The snow had been falling since noon, the thick, wet Cape Breton snow that turned the roads into suggestions and made the streetlights look like they were drowning. She almost didn't get out of the car. She almost went through the drive-thru. But the line was 7 cars deep and she was already late, so she parked and walked toward the entrance, and that was when she saw them. 2 children sitting on the concrete ledge beside the front door. A boy and a girl. Both white, both dressed in clothes that were wrong for the weather. Thin jackets, no hats, no gloves. The boy looked about 6. The girl was maybe 4. They were not crying. The boy had his arm around his sister, holding her against his side with a steadiness that was too practiced, too automatic to be anything other than habit. Grace stopped walking. Something about that arm. The way it wrapped around the smaller body, not with tenderness exactly, but with duty, the way a person holds something they know they cannot afford to drop, made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't felt in years. She crouched down. "You two waiting for somebody?" The boy looked up at her. His eyes were pale blue and far too old for his face. "Our mom's friend dropped us off. She said she'd come back after she went to the store." "When was that?" The boy didn't answer right away. The girl pressed closer into his side. "This morning," he said. Grace looked at the sky. It was past 6. The sun had been gone for 2 hours. She brought them inside. She bought them hot chocolate and 2 butter tarts and sat across from them in a booth while the snow piled against the windows. The boy's name was Liam. The girl was Sophie. Their mother had died of an overdose 11 days earlier in a rooming house on Townsend Street. A woman named Cheryl, a friend of their mother's, had taken them in, and this morning Cheryl had driven them to Tim Hortons and told Liam she needed to run an errand. That was 10 hours ago. Grace called the police. She sat with the children while they waited. When the RCMP cruiser pulled up and two officers walked in, their eyes moved from Grace to the children and back to Grace with the particular kind of attention that she had learned to recognize years ago. Not hostile exactly, but recalibrating, the way people's faces shift when they encounter a picture that doesn't match the frame. "Ma'am, are these your children?" "No. I found them outside. They've been here since this morning." The officer looked at Liam. "Son, do you know this woman?" Liam shook his head. Then he looked at Grace and said, in a voice so small it barely carried across the table, "She bought us hot chocolate." It was the first full sentence Sophie had heard her brother say to a stranger in 11 days. The system took them. That was systems did. They took children and sorted them into columns and assigned them case numbers and moved them from one temporary place to another with the efficient impersonality of a postal service delivering packages that nobody had ordered, cold. Grace went back to work that night and spent 12 hours checking on patients and thinking about a boy's arm around his sister's shoulder. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself the province would handle it. She told herself a lot of things that were technically true and completely insufficient. 3 weeks later, she heard through a nurse at the children's hospital that Liam and Sophie had been through 2 foster placements already. The first family wanted only Sophie. Liam refused to be separated. He stopped eating, stopped talking, sat by the front door with his coat on and wouldn't move. The second placement lasted 4 days before the foster parents called it unmanageable. Grace filed the adoption paperwork on a Monday morning before shift leave. The social worker, a kind but visibly startled woman named Denise Fowler, set down her pen and studied Grace over the top of her reading glasses. "Mrs. Okafor, I want to make sure we're on the same page here. You're a single woman. You work nights. And these children are, well, they're not." She paused, searching for a word that wouldn't sound like the word she meant. "They don't share your background." Grace looked at her steadily. "They don't share anyone's background. That's why they're sleeping in a group home." The process took 5 months. 5 months of home inspections, interviews, background checks, reference letters, and questions that circled the same unspoken doubt in different disguises. A black woman from Nigeria raising 2 white children in Cape Breton. The paperwork couldn't say what the faces said, but Grace could read faces better than paperwork. The judge who signed the final order was a Mi'kmaq woman named Justice Paulette Bernard. She looked at Grace across the bench and said, "These children are lucky to have you, Ms. Okafor." It was the only time in the entire process that anyone said anything like that. The first night in Grace's house, Sophie fell asleep within minutes. The deep, instant collapse of a child whose body had finally stopped listening for danger. But Liam lay rigid under the covers, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Grace checked on them before bed. She stood in the doorway of the small room she had painted blue and yellow over the weekend, and Liam's pale eyes caught hers in the dark. "Are you going to send us back?" His voice was flat. Not scared, emptied. Grace didn't answer with words. She pulled the rocking chair from the corner, set it beside his bed, and sat down. She picked up her knitting from the basket beside the chair. She was halfway through a pair of red mittens she had started for Sophie because the girl's hands had been bare that night at Tim Hortons, and Grace hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. She knitted quietly, the needles clicking in the dark, and she stayed there the entire night. When Liam woke the next morning, Grace was still in the chair, the finished mittens in her lap, her head tilted back, asleep but present. Something in his face shifted. Not a smile, not yet, but a crack in something that had been sealed shut for a very long time. The years that followed were exactly as hard as everyone had warned her they would be. Tuned. A black single mother raising 2 white children in a Cape Breton town that was 97% white That was a sentence that made people uncomfortable in a specifically Canadian way, not with open hostility, but with a polite bafflement that was almost worse, because you couldn't fight what nobody would admit to feeling. The first day of schools set the tone. Grace walked Liam and Sophie through the front doors of Sydney Elementary, holding each of their hands. The woman at the front desk smiled at the children, then looked up at Grace and said brightly, "Oh, are you their nanny?" "I'm their mother," Grace said. The smile didn't disappear. It rearranged itself into something cautious and effortful, the expression of a person trying to find the correct facial response to information that didn't fit any category they had been given. A father in the hallway saw the three of them and steered his son gently to the other side of the corridor, not dramatically, not meanly, just with the careful automaticity of someone avoiding a puddle on the sidewalk. That evening, Liam sat at the kitchen table with his snack untouched. "Mom, why do people look at us like that?" Grace sat down across from him so their eyes were level. "Because they haven't seen this before." That doesn't make it wrong. It just means we're first. There were harder moments. When Sophie was 9, Grace attended a school concert where Sophie had a solo in the choir. Grace sat in the third row wearing the dress she saved for church and held her phone ready to record. After the performance, a woman named Karen MacLeod, chair of the parent council, the kind of person whose opinions circulated through the school like weather reports, approached Grace in the lobby. "I have to ask, and I mean this in the most respectful way," Karen said, loud enough for the parents nearby to hear. "Has Children's Aid actually reviewed this arrangement recently? A single woman of your situation, raising 2 children who clearly aren't." She let the sentence dangle, as if finishing it would have been the rude part. Grace felt every pair of eyes in that lobby. She could have shouted. She could have walked out. Instead, she opened the folder she always carried to school events. Liam's and Sophie's report cards, their attendance records, notes from teachers praising their progress. She laid them on the table the way a person lays down a winning hand. "This is the only answer I owe anyone," Grace said, "and it's the only one that matters." The lobby went quiet. Karen MacLeod did not bring it up again, but the moment that cut deepest, the one Grace carried for years like a stone lodged behind her ribs, came when Sophie was 14. Grace drove to the high school to pick Sophie up from volleyball practice. She waited in the parking lot the way she always did, leaning against her old Civic with her coat zipped up to her chin, because November in Cape Breton didn't care about your comfort. When Sophie came out with a group of friends, one of the girls looked at Grace and asked who she was. Sophie glanced at her mother, then back at her friend, and said, "Oh, she's our cleaning lady. She helps out around the house." She said it quickly, the way teenagers throw words like stones, without checking where they land. Liam heard about it that same evening from a classmate who had been there. He confronted Sophie in the kitchen, his voice sharp with a fury that Grace had never heard from him before. "She's our mother, Sophie." "Our mother? How could you say that?" Sophie broke down. "You don't get it. You're a guy. Nobody asks you every single day why your mom is black. Nobody whispers about it in the change room." Grace was in the hallway. She heard every word. She didn't step in. She walked to the back porch, sat down in the old wooden chair she had bought at a yard sale the summer she moved in, and stayed there for 2 hours watching the harbor lights flicker across the water in the dark. It was the only time in 20 years that Grace allowed herself to wonder whether her love was actually a weight these children would carry forever and eventually resent her for. Whether the color of her skin, the shape of her face, everything that made strangers stare, was something they would spend their whole lives apologizing for or hiding from. 2 days later, Sophie found Grace in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, already dressed for her shift. Sophie stood in the doorway for a long time before she spoke. "I'm sorry, Mom. I was scared. But I was wrong." Grace set down her coffee. "You're not wrong for being scared, sweetheart. You're only wrong if you let fear make your decisions for you." Sophie crossed the kitchen and hugged her hard, the way she used to when she was 4 years old and the world was just a Tim Hortons parking lot and a cup of hot chocolate and a stranger who didn't drive past. There were good years too, quiet years. The Christmas when Sophie was 10 and Liam was 12. Grace's hours at the hospital got cut and money went tight enough that presents weren't happening. So she stayed up until 3 in the morning on Christmas Eve. She knitted Sophie a scarf to match those red mittens from the first night. The mittens Sophie had long outgrown, but still kept in her bedside drawer like a relic. And for Liam, she rebuilt his broken hockey stick with fiberglass tape and repainted it Canadian's red, because he'd been asking for months and she couldn't afford a new one. On Christmas morning, Liam unwrapped the stick and understood immediately what it meant. Not the paint, but the hours. He didn't say anything. He just put his arms around Grace and held on. Sophie ran to her room and came back. Card sheet had drawn in colored pencil, a small house with 3 people standing in front of it. 1 tall and dark, 2 shorter and light, and underneath in careful block letters, "Our family." Grace put that card in her wallet. She carried it there for the next 15 years, through every night shift, every Sunday at church, every quiet evening on the porch watching the harbor. It would still be there the night she was arrested. Turn. Liam graduated from Dalhousie Law School at the top of his class. Grace sat in the front row wearing the same dress she wore to church and every school event, the navy blue one she had bought second-hand from the Salvation Army the year she adopted them, and never found an occasion important enough to replace, because every occasion that involved her children was already the most important thing that had ever happened to her. When Liam stood at the podium and addressed the graduating class, he said, "I'm standing here because one woman taught me that you don't wait for justice to show up. You build it yourself, with your hands, every single day." Grace lowered her head. For the first time since Paul left, she cried in front of other people. Sophie was working as an investigative journalist at the Halifax Chronicle-Herald by then. Liam was practicing criminal defense law in Toronto. The 2 children that nobody had wanted had become exactly the kind of people Grace always knew they could be, not because she pushed them, but because she never let go. And then the phone call came. It was a Wednesday night when everything broke. The Cape Breton Regional Health Authority announced that a 6-month internal investigation had uncovered systematic theft of opioid medications, oxycodone, hydromorphone, fentanyl patches, from the hospital's pharmacy and secure dispensing units. The total value was estimated at over $400,000. Within 72 hours, Grace Okafor was in handcuffs. The case against her rested on 3 things, and every one of them was thin enough to see through if anyone cared to look. First, electronic dispensing logs showed Grace's access badge had been used to withdraw controlled medications on dozens of occasions over the past 2 years. Quantities that exceeded what her assigned patients required. Second, an anonymous tip had directed investigators to Grace specifically, claiming she had been seen transferring medications to an unknown individual in the hospital parking lot. Third, Grace had filed a formal complaint 8 months earlier about irregularities in the pharmacy's inventory tracking system. Discrepancies between what was ordered, what was logged, and what was actually on the shelves. The complaint had been submitted to the hospital's director of operations, a man named Malcolm Burgess. The prosecution framed that complaint as an attempt to preemptively cover her tracks. Grace told the investigators the truth. Her badge records were wrong. She had reported the inventory problems because they were real. She had never taken a single pill that wasn't prescribed to a patient in her care. But the truth in a town like Sydney had a way of bending around a black woman the way light bends around something heavy, close enough to graze but never quite reaching. The legal aid lawyer assigned to her case visited once, a tired woman with a caseload that could fill a shipping container. She sat across from Grace in the Cape Breton Correctional Center and laid it out plain. "They're pushing for trafficking charges. That's a mandatory minimum. My honest advice, plead to simple possession and theft under. You'd be looking at 2 years less a day instead of 5 to 10. Grace looked at her. I didn't steal anything. Mrs. Okafor, I hear you. But the jury pool in this county is what it is. A black woman accused of stealing opioids during a crisis that's killed people's children and parents. The math isn't in your favor. Grace leaned forward. I have spent my entire life teaching my children that the truth matters, that you don't hide and you don't lie and you don't let fear make your choices. I'm not going to plead guilty to something I didn't do. The legal aid lawyer withdrew from the case a week before trial, citing workload constraints. Grace was left with no lawyer and a trial date that wasn't moving. The call reached Sophie first. Pastor Williams from Mount Olive Baptist phoned her office at the Chronicle Herald on a Thursday afternoon. Sophie, I'm sorry to tell you this. Your mother's been arrested. They're saying she stole medication from the hospital. Sophie was in the middle of the biggest story of her career. A provincial government procurement scandal that had taken 4 months to build. She closed her laptop without saving, was in her car within 20 minutes, and was on the Trans-Canada heading for Cape Breton within the hour. Liam got the news that evening. He was in Toronto preparing for a charter challenge that had consumed 6 months of his life. But when he pulled the Crown's disclosure for Grace's case and read through the evidence, the lawyer in him saw immediately what the son in him already knew. The entire case rested on digital logs that could be manipulated, an anonymous tip that couldn't be cross-examined, and a complaint that the prosecution had twisted into consciousness of guilt. No physical evidence. No forensic trail. No witness who had actually seen Grace take anything. He called Sophie. This case is held together with tape and assumptions. Someone needed Mom to take the fall. Sophie's voice was steady. I know. I'm already driving. They met at a gas station in New Glasgow, halfway between Halifax and Sydney. They stood beside Sophie's car under a buzzing fluorescent light, 2 grown adults who had once been 2 frozen children in a parking lot, and they made a decision without needing many words. They were going back to the town that had watched their family sideways for 20 years. They were going to stand in a courtroom and fight a system that had never been built to protect people who looked like their mother. The trial began on a Monday morning in the Sydney courthouse. The Crown prosecutor was Janet Ahern, a meticulous litigator with a conviction rate the Cape Breton Post loved to cite. She was not theatrical, she was precise, the kind of prosecutor who could make circumstantial evidence sound like gravity, inevitable and impossible to argue with. Liam took his place beside Grace at the defense table. When the jury saw a young white man in a tailored suit sit down next to the black defendant and place his hand on her shoulder, the whispers moved through the gallery like wind through grass. Jury selection told Liam everything. 11 white jurors, 1 black. He challenged the composition. Justice Alan McNeil, a Sydney-born judge who had occupied that bench for 22 years, denied the challenge without elaboration. Ahern's opening was surgical. She never mentioned race. She didn't need to. Gowned. She spoke about community trust, about the opioid crisis that had taken sons and daughters from Cape Breton families, about the sacred responsibility of a nurse, with access to the most dangerous medications on Earth. Every sentence was calibrated to activate fear instead of evidence. Liam stood and went the other direction. No performance. Just a question. Where is the physical evidence? The Crown wants you to believe my client stole hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of medication. Where is it? Not in her home, they searched it. Not in her bank account, they audited it. Not on her person, they tested her. All they have is a computer log, an anonymous phone call, and a woman who tried to do the right thing by reporting a problem and got punished for it. The Crown's key witness was a pharmacy technician named Craig Donovan, who testified that he had seen Grace accessing the dispensing cabinet at unusual hours. Liam's cross-examination was brief and devastating. He produced the facility layout showing that the dispensing cabinet in question was not visible from Donovan's workstation. He established that Donovan had received a promotion to senior technician 3 weeks after the investigation began, a promotion approved by Malcolm Burgess. He asked one final question. Mr. Donovan, who asked you to watch Ms. Okafor specifically? Donovan looked toward the prosecution table before answering. Mr. Burgess mentioned I should keep an eye on things. Liam let the silence hold. No further questions. While Liam fought inside the courtroom, Sophie worked outside it. She pulled publicly available procurement records for the hospital, cross-referenced pharmaceutical supply orders with actual dispensing logs, and began interviewing former employees who were willing to talk. What she found was larger than one woman being framed. Malcolm Burgess had been running a diversion scheme for at least 3 years. He had been ordering excess controlled substances through inflated requisitions, logging them as dispensed to patients who either didn't exist or didn't require them, and funneling the surplus to a network that sold them on the street across the Maritimes. The scheme had been draining the hospital, while people in the community were dying from the same drugs being sold out the back door. Grace had stumbled onto the edge of it without knowing the full picture. As a senior nurse, she noticed that medication counts didn't match. Pills logged as given to patients she had personally cared for, patients she knew hadn't received them. She reported the discrepancies to Burgess directly, not knowing he was the source. 8 months later, she was in handcuffs. Sophie called Liam from her motel room at midnight. Liam, this wasn't random. Burgess has been diverting opioids for years. Find. Mom found the discrepancies and reported them straight to him. She handed the fox the key to the henhouse, and he used it to bury her. On the other end of the line, Liam was quiet for a long moment. Then, can you prove it? I can prove enough to make a judge listen. But Malcolm Burgess had not built a scheme that lasted 3 years by being careless. Within days of Sophie's inquiries, 2 former hospital employees who had agreed to speak went silent. One texted Sophie a single message. I can't. I'm sorry. I still work in healthcare in this province. Then Sophie's managing editor in Halifax called. His tone was careful. The tone people use when they're reading from someone else's script. Sophie, you're on personal leave. You're not conducting investigations for the paper. If your press credentials are being used to interfere with an active criminal proceeding, we'll need to discuss your employment. Sophie understood what that meant. Someone with influence had picked up a phone. The weight fell heaviest on Grace. In the correctional center, stripped of her routine, separated from everything that had given her life shape for 20 years, Grace began to go quiet. She barely ate. During visits, Liam sat across from her, separated by plexiglass, and saw something in her eyes he had never seen there. Not anger, not fear, but a deep, flat exhaustion that looked like surrender. I want you both to stop, Grace said. Her voice was steady, but the words were heavy as stone. You and Sophie, go back to your lives. You've worked too hard for this. Liam placed his hand flat against the glass. Mom, you didn't quit when the whole town said you had no business raising us. You didn't quit when Karen McLeod humiliated you at that concert. You didn't quit when Sophie broke your heart and you sat on that porch all night and still showed up the next morning as her mother. So don't ask me to quit now. Grace looked at his hand, pressed against the divider. She raised her own and placed it against the same spot. Their palms separated by an inch of plexiglass and 20 years of everything they had survived together. That evening, Liam and Sophie had the hardest conversation of their lives in the motel parking lot. Sophie wanted to publish immediately, blow the story open, and let public pressure do what the courtroom wasn't doing. Liam said no. If you publish before I present it, Ahern files for a mistrial. The jury gets tainted. Mom sits in that cell for another 6 months waiting for a new trial. She won't survive that. Sophie shot back. And if the judge shuts you down inside the courtroom, then what? At least if the public knows, I'm her lawyer, Sophie. I need you to trust me. Sophie stared at the cracked pavement for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, but her voice was controlled. I do trust you, but I remember standing in the hallway and hearing Mom on that porch the night I called her our cleaning lady. She sat out there alone for 2 hours because I was too ashamed to call her my mother. I will not let anyone make her sit alone again. They agreed on a plan. Liam would file a motion to introduce the evidence in court. If the judge accepted it, they would fight inside the system. If the judge rejected it, Sophie would publish within the hour. The judge denied the motion. The defense's supplementary materials pertain to administrative irregularities at the hospital which are outside the scope of this criminal proceeding. Liam felt the ruling land on his chest like a physical weight. Ahern delivered her closing that afternoon with the calm confidence of a woman who knew the current was flowing her way. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned deadlocked. Justice McNeil instructed them to resume the following morning. That night, in a cell with a concrete floor and a single overhead light, Grace reached into the personal effects bag they had let her keep and pulled out her wallet, the same worn wallet she had carried for 20 years, and took out a piece of paper creased and softened by 15 years of folding and unfolding, a card drawn in colored pencil by a 10-year-old girl on a Christmas morning when money was too tight for real presents. 3 figures in front of a small house, 2 words in careful block letters. Our family. Grace held the card under the thin light that leaked through the door slot. She traced the pencil lines with her fingertip. Then she pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes. Across town, in a motel room that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner, Sophie was not sleeping. She was staring at a ceiling and making a decision that no journalism school had prepared her for. She picked up her phone and scrolled to a name she had found 3 days earlier in the hospital's old HR records and hadn't known what to do with until now. Doris Campbell. Former administrative assistant to Malcolm Burgess, 21 years at the hospital, quietly let go 4 months ago with a sealed separation agreement. Sophie drove to Doris Campbell's house at 11 that night. A small bungalow on a cul-de-sac in Whitney Pier, curtains drawn, porch light off. She knocked, no answer. She knocked again and spoke through the door. Mrs. Campbell, my name is Sophie Okafor. I know you worked at Cape Breton Regional for 21 years, and I know you were pushed out after they arrested my mother. I'm not here as a reporter, I'm here as a daughter. My mother is sitting in a cell tonight for something she didn't do, and I believe you know something that could help her. The street was silent. The seconds stretched. Then the deadbolt turned. Doris Campbell was in her 60s, gray-haired, reading glasses on a chain. She looked at Sophie the way a person looks at something they have been expecting and dreading in equal measure. She studied Sophie's face for a long time. Whatever she found there was enough. She stepped aside. What Doris told her changed everything. She had personally handled the purchase orders that Burgess used to inflate pharmaceutical requisitions. She had watched him alter dispensing logs after hours. She had found a USB drive in his office containing a spreadsheet that tracked every diverted shipment, every street-level contact, every dollar. When she confronted him, he told her, not asked, told, "You were never in that office. You never saw that drive. Do you understand me, Doris?" 2 weeks later, her employment was terminated. Her pension, administered through a hospital fund that Burgess controlled, was contingent on the terms of her separation agreement. The message was silent and absolute. Sophie asked why she hadn't gone to the police. Doris looked at her folded hands. Because in this town, when the people who sign your pension tell you to be quiet, you stay quiet. That's how it's always been. Sophie leaned forward. It doesn't have to be that way tomorrow. The next morning, Liam filed an emergency motion to call a new witness. Ahern was on her feet instantly. This is a delay tactic, Your Honor. Defense had every opportunity. Liam cited R.V. Stinchcombe. He cited the charter right to full answer and defense. He argued that Doris Campbell had direct first-hand knowledge of an alternative explanation for the very evidence the Crown was relying on to convict his mother. If this court denies Ms. Okafor the right to present this testimony, it denies her the right to a fair trial. Justice McNeil weighed 2 things: his instinct to control his courtroom and his knowledge that the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal would not look kindly on a judge who blocked exculpatory testimony in a case built on circumstantial evidence. The motion is granted. The witness will be heard. Doris Campbell took the stand in a courtroom so quiet that the sound of her shoes on the floor echoed off the walls. She was not dramatic. She did not cry. She described Malcolm Burgess's diversion scheme in plain, clear language. The inflated orders, the altered logs, the USB drive. She recounted his exact words. "You were never in that office," and she explained without self-pity why she had stayed silent. The pension, the pressure, the unspoken rules of a company town. Ahern cross-examined hard. "Mrs. Campbell, why should this jury believe something you waited months to say?" Doris turned to the jury. "I kept quiet because I was afraid." "Because that's what people do when the person who controls your future tells you to be silent. I'm not proud of it. But I'm here now because I watched a good woman get charged with something she didn't do, and my silence was helping it happen." Liam rose for his closing. He did not raise his voice. He spoke the way Grace had taught him to speak, plainly, directly, as if the truth didn't need decoration. "My mother, Grace Okafor, spent 20 years raising 2 children, World said weren't hers to raise. She never asked why she should. She never asked what she'd get in return. And when she discovered that something was wrong at the hospital where she'd worked for 19 years, she didn't stay quiet. She reported it. She reported it because that is who she is. A woman who does the right thing even when the right thing has a cost. That cost is why she's sitting here today. Not because of evidence. Because a powerful man needed someone to blame, and Grace Okafor, a black woman in a town that has never quite figured out what to do with black women who don't stay in their lane, was the easiest target available. Justice is not something you wait for. It's something you build. Today, you are the builders. The jury deliberated for 53 minutes. The foreperson, an older woman who had sat through every day of the trial without readable expression, stood and unfolded a single piece of paper. "On all charges, we find the defendant not guilty." Grace did not move. She sat perfectly still, eyes closed, hands flat on the table. Liam placed his hand on her shoulder, the same gesture from the first morning of the trial. And this time neither of them let go. Sophie came from the gallery and wrapped her arms around both of them. And for a long moment, the three of them held each other in the middle of a courtroom that had tried to break them apart. Grace opened her eyes, looked at her children, both crying, both strong in ways that still amazed her, and said the first thing that came to her, "You two grew up on me." Sophie laughed through her tears, and the sound filled the courtroom the way a room is filled when someone lets themselves be fully, unapologetically present in it. In the weeks that followed, Sophie's investigation was published. The story detailed the opioid diversion scheme, Burgess's network, and the systematic cover-up that had nearly sent an innocent woman to prison. The RCMEP opened a federal investigation. Malcolm Burgess was charged with fraud, trafficking, and obstruction. Craig Donovan pleaded guilty to perjury. The Nova Scotia Health Authority launched a provincial review of pharmaceutical oversight at every hospital in the province. Grace went home. The small house near the harbor was older now, the paint more weathered, the porch chair a little more worn. But the photo in the hallway was the same one that had been there for 20 years. Sophie took the pencil-drawn card, "Our Family," and had it sealed in a clear frame. She placed it on the bookshelf in the living room, beside a pair of small red mittens that a 4-year-old girl had outgrown 2 decades ago, but that Grace had never been able to put away. Card and the mittens sat there side by side. One made by a mother's hands on a winter night when she chose to stay, the other made by a daughter's hands on a Christmas morning when she chose to say what she already knew. Grace sat on her porch that evening and watched the harbor lights come on the way she had 1,000 times before. Sophie sat on the steps beside her. Liam leaned against the railing. Nobody spoke for a while. Some things don't need words. They just need presence. When Grace finally broke the silence, she said something neither of her children expected. "People always ask me why I adopted you two. I never had a good answer, but I think I do now." She looked at them both. "I stopped at that Tim Hortons because I needed rice and the store next door was closed. I stayed because I needed you more than you ever needed me." Sophie shook her head and smiled. Mom, that's the most ridiculous and truest thing you've ever said. And somewhere out there right now, someone is making a choice to love a person the world says isn't theirs to love. That choice, as quiet and unremarkable as it might seem tonight, might be the only thing strong enough to save them both 20 years from now. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about the person who showed up for you or the person you showed up for, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me, who's your Grace? And if you haven't already, hit subscribe. Stories like this one deserve to be heard, and you being here is what makes that possible.